I lost the best job opportunity of my life because somebody decided a wheelchair ramp was less important than a pile of construction trash. And 4 months later, the same people were standing in front of microphones trying to explain why their entire community had become the subject of a state investigation. Funny how life works sometimes. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 39 years old, and until a few years ago, I thought being reasonable could solve almost any problem. Turns out, some people see reason as weakness, and some organizations get so comfortable pushing people around that they forget what happens when they finally push the wrong person. Back then, I lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Mesa, Arizona. Nothing fancy, just one of those communities where every mailbox matched, every lawn looked exactly 6 hours away from being featured in a landscaping magazine, and every resident got a monthly newsletter reminding us of rules nobody actually remembered voting for. I worked as a structural consultant, mostly commercial projects, schools, office buildings, warehouses, that sort of thing. The work paid the bills, but I had been chasing something bigger for nearly a year. A senior project management position with a major engineering firm in Scottsdale. Better salary, better benefits, more responsibility, and honestly, a chance to finally feel like all those years of grinding had led somewhere. The company had already put me through multiple interviews, phone calls, technical evaluations, leadership panels. By the time everything started falling apart, I was down to the final stage. 3 meetings left before an official offer. I remember coming home on a Tuesday afternoon, tired but excited because the first of those final interviews was scheduled for the next morning. I turned onto my street, waved at a neighbor walking his dog, pulled into my driveway, and immediately knew something wasn't right. There were orange construction barriers everywhere. Bright plastic fencing stretched across the side access path that connected my front porch to the parking area. Stacks of concrete chunks sat where my wheelchair route normally ran. Broken lumber, gravel, and discarded piping had been dumped directly across the only accessible path leading from my house. At first, I thought somebody made a mistake. Construction crews screw things up all the time. I parked, rolled toward the porch, and asked one of the workers what was going on. The guy looked uncomfortable before saying, "Management told us to stage materials here temporarily." I stared at him. "You mean on the wheelchair access route?" He shrugged. "I just do what they tell me, sir." Temporary. That's the word people use when they don't want you asking more questions. The next morning, I discovered just how temporary they meant. I couldn't reach my vehicle without help. Couldn't navigate around the barriers safely. Couldn't use the access route required by the original property plans. After spending nearly 2 hours trying to figure out an alternative, I missed the interview. The recruiter was polite. She rescheduled. I thanked her and promised it wouldn't happen again. Then I called the homeowners association office. The property manager, a woman named Linda Carson, answered after transferring me through 3 different departments. I explained the situation calmly. I explained the blocked access route. I explained that I used a wheelchair. I explained that I had important employment meetings scheduled. Her response was immediate. "The work is authorized community maintenance." "Okay," I said, "but how long is this supposed to last?" Papers shuffled on her end. "Approximately 6 to 8 weeks. I honestly laughed because I thought she was joking. 6 to 8 weeks? You're blocking the only accessible route to my property. Silence. Then, those are the projected timelines. I remember gripping the phone so hard my hand hurt. I just missed a job interview because of this. Another pause. Then came the sentence that stuck in my head for months. "Mr. Brooks, we don't redesign operations around individual circumstances." Individual circumstances. Like being unable to leave your own home. Like having a disability. Like trying to keep your career from slipping away. Before I could respond, she added, "Everyone has challenges," and hung up. I sat there staring at the disconnected phone screen for several seconds. Not angry yet. Just stunned. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation somehow got worse. The construction barely moved. Materials sat untouched. Workers came and went. Some days nobody showed up at all. I missed the rescheduled interview. Then another. By the 3rd week, the engineering firm called and told me they had moved forward with another candidate. The recruiter sounded genuinely disappointed. I thanked her for the opportunity, ended the call, and just sat on my porch for a long time. You ever have one of those moments where you're not sure whether you're sad or furious? That's where I was. Looking at a blocked pathway. Looking at a future that had just disappeared. Wondering how something so ridiculous had somehow become real. As the sun started dropping behind the rooftops, I noticed someone across the property line watching me from her garden. She lived next door, a retired judge named Margaret Holloway. Most people in the neighborhood knew her as the woman with perfect roses and impossibly straight hedges. I knew her for a different reason. 3 years earlier, when structural issues threatened to destroy her home and contractors were recommending complete demolition, I had spent weeks helping redesign a stabilization plan. I never charged her a dime. She never forgot it. That evening, she walked over carrying a watering can, looked at the barriers, looked at me, and asked one simple question. "Ethan, what exactly happened here?" I took a deep breath and started telling her everything. I thought the conversation would last maybe 5 minutes. Just neighbors talking. Maybe she'd shake her head, tell me it sounded unfair, and head back to her roses. Instead, Margaret set the watering can down beside my porch steps and listened without interrupting for nearly half an hour. I told her about the blocked access route, the missed interviews, the phone calls, the construction delays, and especially the comment from the property manager about not redesigning operations around individual circumstances. The entire time she stood there quietly, asking an occasional question, the kind of questions people ask when they're trying to understand every detail rather than simply react to the headline. When I finished, she looked at the barriers again, then at the construction debris, then back at me. "Do you have records?" she asked. "Photos." I nodded. "Emails too." "Good." Her voice had changed. Not louder, not angrier, just sharper, more focused. "Gather everything." That night, I pulled together months of documentation. Photographs with timestamps, HOA emails, certified letters I'd sent requesting accommodation, copies of community plans showing the designated accessible route, notes from conversations, even engineering assessments showing how easily temporary access could have been maintained if anyone had bothered to plan properly. Around 9 that evening, I carried the entire stack next door. Margaret invited me into her study. The room looked exactly how you'd imagine a retired judge's office would look. Shelves packed with legal volumes, framed certificates, neatly organized files. She sat behind a large oak desk and began reviewing documents while I answered questions. Sometimes she'd stop and circle a sentence. Sometimes she'd lean back and stare at the ceiling for a few seconds. Around midnight, she finally closed the folder. "They're in trouble." I laughed weakly. "I think you're overestimating my chances." She shook her head. "No, Ethan. I think you're underestimating theirs." The next morning, she knocked on my door carrying a legal pad thick enough to stop a bullet. "We're filing multiple actions," she said. "Accessibility violations, discrimination concerns, property interference, emergency relief." I blinked. "We?" She smiled. "3 years ago, you saved my house. Now let me do my job." 2 days later, we were sitting inside a county courtroom. I had never been part of a legal proceeding like that before. My stomach felt tied into knots. Across the room sat Linda Carson, the property manager, along with 2 HOA board members and their attorney. The confidence they carried into the courtroom lasted about 20 minutes. Margaret presented photographs showing the blocked route. She presented correspondence proving the HOA had been repeatedly informed of the accessibility problem. She presented engineering diagrams showing alternative staging locations available throughout the project. Then she presented copies of the responses I'd received. The judge reviewed everything carefully. At one point, he looked directly at the HOA attorney and asked, "Can you explain why no alternative access was provided?" The attorney shuffled papers. The association believed the inconvenience would be temporary. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Temporary?" Margaret immediately slid another document forward. Construction logs. Weeks of inactivity. Delays. Work stoppages. The courtroom became very quiet. Then came the part nobody expected. The judge ordered an immediate investigation into the broader management practices of the association. Not because he was looking for additional violations, but because the evidence suggested a pattern of disregard rather than a single mistake. I remember seeing Linda's face change the moment she realized what that meant. Up until then, they thought they were fighting one resident. Suddenly, they were answering questions about the entire operation. Within days, county inspectors started arriving throughout the neighborhood. At first, most residents didn't think much of it. Communities get inspected all the time. But then the notices started appearing. One property had an unpermitted expansion. Another had drainage modifications violating county regulations. Another had structures built inside utility easements. The list kept growing. Every day seemed to bring another discovery. One afternoon, my neighbor Steve walked over holding a citation notice and said, "What exactly did you start?" I laughed. "Honestly, I just wanted access to my driveway." He shook his head. "Well, now half the board is panicking." The real disaster arrived 2 weeks into the audit. Inspectors discovered that the HOA president's detached garage partially obstructed a public drainage easement. Not by inches, by enough to create genuine flood risk concerns during seasonal storms. Suddenly, the person who had spent years enforcing rules against everyone else was standing on the wrong side of compliance enforcement. The irony wasn't lost on anybody, especially not the residents. Community meetings became chaos. Homeowners demanded answers. Board members blamed contractors. Contractors blamed management. Management blamed paperwork errors. Nobody accepted responsibility. Meanwhile, penalties accumulated daily. Some violations carried fines. Others required corrective action. Others triggered additional reviews. Every week, the total financial exposure climbed higher. One evening, I received a call from a friend who still attended HOA meetings. "You should have seen tonight." "What happened?" I asked. He laughed. "The president spent 20 minutes explaining why rules matter. Then somebody asked why those rules only mattered when regular residents broke them. Apparently, the room erupted. By the third month, the association was hemorrhaging money. Legal bills exploded. Consultants were hired. Engineers were brought in. Surveyors reviewed property lines. Compliance experts reviewed records going back years. Residents who had never questioned leadership suddenly started examining budgets and decisions. Old grievances resurfaced. Forgotten complaints returned. People who had been ignored for years finally felt empowered to speak. That's when another piece of information surfaced. Several former board members privately admitted they'd raised concerns about accessibility issues before. They had been dismissed. One even produced meeting notes showing recommendations for accommodation policies that were never implemented because management considered them unnecessary expenses. Unnecessary expenses. I couldn't stop thinking about those words. Apparently, making sure disabled residents could access their own homes had been viewed as a budget problem. Around that time, Linda Carson called me unexpectedly. Her tone sounded completely different from the woman who had once hung up on me. "Ethan, perhaps we can discuss a resolution." I almost laughed. "A resolution?" "The board is interested in moving forward constructively." Constructively would have been 4 months ago. Silence. Then she tried another approach. "Certain outcomes may benefit everyone." Did they benefit everyone when I lost my job opportunity? More silence. She ended the call shortly afterward. But that conversation told me everything I needed to know. For the first time since this nightmare started, they were afraid. Not of me personally. Of consequences. Real consequences. The kind that couldn't be buried in committee meetings or hidden behind procedural language. A week later, Margaret invited me over for coffee. She spread several documents across her dining room table. Settlement proposals. Financial analyses. Compliance reports. "They're running out of options," she said. "How bad is it?" I asked. She slid one page toward me. The projected costs were staggering. Penalties. Legal fees. Remediation expenses. Administrative reviews. Insurance complications. The numbers looked unreal. "Their carrier is challenging coverage," she explained. "They may be responsible for much of this themselves." I sat back in my chair. All because they wouldn't move some construction materials? Margaret shook her head slowly. "No, because they spent years believing they didn't have to answer to anyone." That sentence stayed with me. Because she was right. This had stopped being about one blocked ramp a long time ago. The ramp was only the crack that finally exposed everything underneath. Weeks later, as investigations continued and residents demanded leadership changes, the board requested formal settlement negotiations. And for the first time since this entire mess began, the people who had ignored every request, every email, every warning, were finally ready to listen. The settlement meeting took place on a Thursday morning inside a conference room at the county administration building. And if you'd told me 6 months earlier that the same people who couldn't spare 30 seconds to consider a reasonable accommodation would eventually spend 8 straight hours trying to negotiate their way out of a disaster, I probably would have laughed. Yet there they were. The HOA president looked exhausted. Linda Carson looked like she hadn't slept in days. Their attorney spent most of the meeting whispering into people's ears and sliding papers back and forth across the table. Meanwhile, Margaret sat beside me completely calm, occasionally making notes, occasionally asking questions, never raising her voice because she didn't need to. The facts were already doing all the work for her. By lunchtime, it became obvious the board had lost. The only question remaining was how much damage they could limit. The final agreement required them to reimburse every documented expense connected to the obstruction, cover thousands of dollars in accessibility restoration costs, issue a formal written apology that would remain part of the public record, and adopt new accommodation procedures subject to outside review. But the provision everyone talked about afterward wasn't the money. It wasn't the apology. It wasn't even the compliance requirements. It was what happened next. Because of the audit findings, repeated violations, and management failures uncovered during the investigation, state authorities imposed a long-term oversight program on future development activity within the community. Every major construction permit would face enhanced review for years. What had once been a simple rubber stamp process suddenly became a level of scrutiny nobody on the board had imagined possible. The neighborhood newsletter that arrived the following month looked completely different. Half the leadership team had resigned. Several committees were dissolved. Elections were scheduled. Residents demanded transparency. People who had never attended meetings before suddenly filled every available chair. Funny enough, some of those same neighbors who barely knew my name started stopping me on the sidewalk just to shake my hand. Not because I had won anything, but because many of them had their own stories. Small stories. Being ignored. Being talked down to. Being told rules mattered only when convenient. One elderly resident told me she'd spent 2 years asking for a simple handrail near a community walkway and was repeatedly dismissed. Another family described months of frustration trying to resolve drainage problems that management refused to acknowledge. Over and over, I heard versions of the same theme. Nobody listened until somebody was finally forced to. A few months later, I received a phone call from another engineering firm. Better position, better benefits, better leadership opportunities. The salary was significantly higher than the one I'd originally lost. During my first week there, one of the managers asked how I'd handled such a difficult year without completely losing my mind. I remember laughing and saying, honestly, there were days I almost did. Because the truth is, what hurt most wasn't the lost opportunity. It wasn't even being trapped at home. It was the feeling of being invisible. The feeling that somebody could look directly at a problem affecting your life and decide it simply wasn't important enough to matter. That's the part that stays with you. That's the part people don't always understand. These situations are rarely about a ramp, a fence, a driveway, or a rule. They're about respect, about whether people see each other as neighbors or obstacles, about whether power is used responsibly or simply exercised because it can be. Every now and then I still see Linda around town. We don't speak. We just nod politely and continue walking. The anger disappeared a long time ago. Life's too short to carry that much weight forever. As for Margaret, she still lives next door. Every morning when I leave for work, I pass the access path that was eventually rebuilt properly, wider and safer than before. And more often than not, she's outside tending those same roses. Sometimes she waves first. Sometimes I do. Neither of us usually says much. We don't have to. We both remember how all of this started. One blocked path. One bad decision. One organization convinced nobody could challenge it. Looking back, the strangest part is that the entire disaster could have been avoided with a single conversation and a little common decency. Move the materials. Create a temporary route. Treat a resident like a human being. That's all it would have taken. Instead, pride got involved. Arrogance got involved. And once those things take control, people start making expensive mistakes. So whenever someone asks whether I think the outcome was fair, I usually answer with a question of my own. If a community's leaders can ignore a resident for 4 months, cost him a career opportunity, dismiss legitimate concerns, and face no consequences at all, would that have been fair? Maybe you'll agree with me. Maybe you won't. That's the interesting part. Because stories like this always divide people. Some think the board got exactly what it deserved. Others think the consequences went too far. Personally, I think accountability feels extreme only to people who never expected to face it. But that's just my opinion. What do you think? Was the community leadership treated fairly, or did the punishment outweigh the original mistake? Have you ever witnessed an HOA, neighborhood board, or local authority abuse its power and then get called out for it? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And trust me, some of the stories people share are even crazier than mine.